Welcome back to A Bite from the Money Sandwich, where we provide practical and easy to understand tips and ideas on how to manage your money better, so as to let you retire with comfort and on your own terms. When thinking about retirement, a lot of people just focus on the money, but there is a lot of other important areas such as your health when planning for this next stage of life. Today, I am joined by Professor Joanne Earl, who is a psychologist and researcher at Macquarie University here in Sydney. Her program of research focuses on developing solutions to improve pre- and post-retirement planning at both the individual and organisational level, along with identifying predictors of retirement adjustment for retirees. In this episode, Jo will talk about her holistic retirement planning research, as health and your next big challenge, for example, are just as important as the finances. As we all want to make sure the transition to this next stage of life is a positive one, as everyone deserves to retire with comfort and on their own terms. Well, welcome, Jo, to this podcast.
Thanks very much, Mark. It's always a pleasure to talk to you about my research.
Yes. One of the things when I've definitely heard you speak at conferences and so on, it was always around retirement, which is something that I'm very passionate about. But so how does the head of psychology of Macquarie get involved in retirement?
Well, I'm not exactly the head of psychology, but I am a professor of psychology at Macquarie University. Well, I started having a look at career development. That was where my main area of research was originally. And then I started having a look at what was happening for career development for mature age workers. And I saw that there were very few conversations going on around career development of mature age workers, and even less conversations about the transition out of work and sometimes back into work, depending upon what people's circumstances are. So I saw this niche in the research marketplace, if you like, about 15 years ago. And that's what I've made the focus of my work today, of retirement planning and adjustment, and not just pre-retirement, but also post-retirement planning.
Right. And you're in the middle of new research right now about holistic retirement planning.
Yeah.
So would you like to tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. I mean, I can't talk enough about this really, because most people think and they know the importance of planning for finances in retirement. But what we've been promoting is a more holistic model to say, well, look, finances are important, but equally important is health. So health and wealth are actually equally important when it comes to predicting retirement adjustment.
Right.
And then social is important as well, social resources. So what we encourage people to do is to, if you like, accumulate resources in these 6 buckets in preparation for retirement. So health and wealth, social, cognitive, emotional, and motivational. All of these 6 buckets sort of need to be filled to maximise retirement adjustment. And as those resources go up and down, then so does retirement adjustment. So we encourage people to, I guess, take a wider lens on what retirement planning means.
Right.
So a lot of people will say, for example, think about leaving work, but and it might be about when they can access their finances, but is that the best reason to leave work?
Yes.
Not really.
Yeah, and because it's something I very simplistic, helping my own clients and coaching is that, yes, I definitely take the financial, that's just a given, but health and that next big challenge, because you've got to keep your brain active, you've got to keep it. And for a lot of people, that means, well, I'm actually just wanting to continue work, maybe slow down a bit, but I enjoy it. And at least if I've got financial freedom, so I'm working because I want to rather than because I have to. That's from a psychological point of view. That's amazing if you can do that.
Yeah, it's true that having a say about how and when you leave work predicts retirement adjustment. So, having the workplace exit that you want matters. And unfortunately, a lot of people end up getting forced out of work earlier than they expect due to ill health. So about 1 in 5 people will leave work earlier than they expected due to ill health. So, we encourage people to think about those resources because there's a bit of a symbiotic relationship between things like health and wealth. If you're not well enough to keep working, then you're going to be forced out earlier than you want to. But similarly, if you don't look after your health when you do retire, then some of that nest egg that you put away might have to be redirected back into health.
And that's a really good point because for me, health, from the health point of view, it's just simply that we're all living longer. So you want to have quality of life, not just quantity of life.
Yeah, very much so. And, I think understanding and making a very considered decision is important. And one of those key considerations really is the timing of getting that workplace exit right. And that's where we're trying to help people at the moment. We're trying to get them to take a bit more time to think about what work means to them, and then why they want to exit beyond just thinking that maybe they've got enough money. So that's where our focus is at the moment, is really around, putting together this career advice with health and wealth.
And how do you find with the health part that it's wrapped up in your work? Because it's, for example, if I'm now not working and I've just gone from full-time work to just nothing, that's got to be a bad effect on your health.
Well, that's true to some extent, right? But it depends on what work meant to you when you were there.
Right.
If work for whatever reason was wearing you out. I mean, for example, you don't see many 80-year-old bricklayers, do you?
Okay.
And that's the point, isn't it? And sometimes people don't enjoy their work, and leaving work can be a relief, or even just changing up what work means to them and how they work, whether or not that's getting more flexibility or working fewer hours or just specialising in a part of the job that they really love. So I think there's this piece of research around that says that people's well-being is connected to working for longer. But what it doesn't necessarily take into consideration is the quality of work that people do or their health status. So I think all of those things in combination need to be considered when people are, determining what's the right exit for them.
Okay. And you're mentioning there about the social. Is that when you're talking about a social element, is that being involved in community? What do you actually mean by the social element?
Yeah, so it can mean a lot of different things. It can just mean having people for tangible support, like people to help you with your shopping or maybe maintenance of your home. But it can also be about having people around you to interact with, to maybe shoulder the burden of some emotional situations that they're in, or when they hit a barrier. But it can also be really good to have people around when it comes to problem solving or decision making, or just, trying to make sense of things. So in the same way that relationships are important to us when we're at work, they're also important to us when we retire. And thinking about where that social network is very much connected back to housing, of course, because a lot of people's goal is to age in place. So, we encourage people to think forward to where, they might be, who they might be connecting with in terms of their social network during retirement or the lead up to retirement.
Yeah, and just from our own, my own personal point of view, we've made that challenge. We've lived in Lane Cove most of all my children's lives, but most of our friends are over near Manly, and so we're thinking of retirement. Well, do we really want to keep the drive, or do we actually just pack up and move over there? Now we're virtually empty nesters. It's those sort of things are actually important to take into consideration. What is the next 10 years of that social networks? What's that going to look like?
Yeah, absolutely, and it goes back to things like transport.
Yes.
Using public transport more, and is it accessible to the areas that you want to visit or be in? And how long do people expect to be driving for? I mean, there's a lot of people driving, into their 90s. My mother-in-law is 91, and she only stopped driving, I think it was last year. So, a lot of people can continue to drive for long periods of time, but maybe that doesn't suit everybody. And so if you do plan to look at alternatives and use public transport more, will it get you to where you want to be?
I can. That makes all perfect sense. You were talking about the emotional side of it as well. I see a lot of, actually, it'd be interesting to get your view on a couple retiring, and someone says, well, I've got this lifestyle, I imagine, in retirement, and the other partner says, no, this is my lifestyle I was expecting in retirement. It's a very emotional decision from a relationship point of view.
Absolutely. And I think as we get more dual career couples retiring together, then that's going to change the dynamic again, because, often the longest that people have spent together during a normal week is been on, holidays, and some of them are, they're 2 weeks at a time, or they're weekends. Yes. And, even during lockdown, when people were at home, the focus was often on their work, or if they were trying to balance kids at home, schooling, then, there's a focus in the family on doing those things. So I think that is a major transition for couples. And I say to my students that we're teaching that I think in the future that helping people to manage those relationships will be a key area of demand for psychologists to help people to better manage those relationships. And I think in previous generations where we saw maybe more dominant male, the old traditional model of men working and women staying at home and being the primary caregiver. In those situations, we saw a different thing happening where women were able to set up, social networks within their community that were often school-based or church-based, or, connections that they'd already established and had gotten into a routine of doing activities. And then we saw, husbands retiring with them and having to fit in with those activities or to find their own activities. But now I think with dual career couples, where people are retiring sometimes around the same time, not always though, so it's not perfectly timed in the way that people might imagine it is. But those combinations of people being at home and in retirement means that people are suddenly spending a lot more time together than previously. And it's almost like looking across the table and saying, what are your interests again? What do you like to do? How do you like to spend your time? I mean, it's those sorts of conversations.
I've often had husband and wives, especially older, and the wife just says, he's just always underfoot. I had my lifestyle. I've got my lifestyle. It's exactly the way I want it. But now it's my husband who's trying to transition. And I do think it is changing. But I think for the area I look at, the 50s and 60s age group, there's still a lot of that. And so that needs a lot of work. I think for a lot of the XYs and millennials, I don't think that's going to be exactly said dual occupations. But I still think that's a bit of a problem area for 50s and 60s, but also, as I'm saying, 50s and 60s is because of divorce.
That's true.
And so,
very true.
That's what this leads to. And then your people are on their own. And so I could absolutely see your students seeing a lot of work in the future because it is going to be a problem.
Yeah, well, I think also too, the impact of divorce, of taking time out to look after children, has had a massive impact on a lot of women's superannuation balances. And so we see women going into retirement with, much smaller nest eggs than men of the same age. And, this, I think, brings up issues about maybe working for longer or finding alternatives, sources of income, or maybe even, rethinking accommodation options. All of those things are sort of on the table.
Yeah, there was a newspaper article only in the last week, and it said on average, it's about $150,000 less because of just those couple of years out from looking after, having given birth to the children. Just those even just having 2 years will make $150,000 difference at the end. So it is a significant gap that needs to be, and I know definitely through family courts and the way that's settling, they're splitting superannuation, but that's up until recently, that was a major problem. And I still think it is something that needs to be addressed because, especially for 50 and 60-year-olds, and we're talking for those still the traditional marriage, the women didn't look after the money, and now they need to. So they need to know that there's actually ways that people they can turn to and get help.
Yeah, I think that this whole issue about, financial literacy in women's an interesting one, because when we've done some studies, we found that women will say that they've got lower levels of financial literacy, but when we test them, they're comparable. So they may believe that they have lower levels of financial literacy than men own, but this is a common problem in most cases of the ownership of skills and abilities. Men tend to rate themselves much higher overall than women do, and financial literacy is no different to that. We also found that when we compared women with self-managed super funds versus women in other funds, retail funds, that the women in self-managed super funds had higher levels of financial literacy again. And that's probably a case of just exposure and having to be more involved in the management of portfolios and to be aware of what's in those portfolios. So I think that there's some interesting things happening there as well in terms of, what happens with financial literacy. But I also think one of the key problems that women have in terms of super is that gender pay gap. I mean,
yes.
We see as gender pay gap, which unfortunately translates into a super pay gap.
That's right. And I think I was actually surprised. I went to a conference, 5-6 years ago, because I come from a small business, so there's only ever 5, 10, 15 of us. So there was never any thought of different pays for different that. But when I went to this major insurance corporation, said, we're really proud that our gender gap's under 10% now. And I thought that struck me. I said, why are you proud that there's still a gap but you're the least? And that just struck me. And I never until then realized how much of a problem it really is.
Oh, that's right. And I think, it was really interesting to see what was happening with Break the Bias on and was Women's Day. Was it last week or the week before? And in any case, there was someone had created a bot, an app bot that was as people were posting, their achievements in Break the Bias, the bot was coming up behind the posts and saying, did you know that this organisation has a gender pay gap of 10%? So, I think that's the sort of stuff that we really need to keep front and centre. We need to make sure that the gender pay gap doesn't translate into poverty for women in older age.
Absolutely. And it is. Women do live longer as well. So, we do need to make sure that this is rectified. Probably also going to the number of people now retired, because it's that's something like I remember going to Japan and they were nearly over 60% retirees. So they have a big problem there, the amount of people working to fund the people who are retired. I think we're in Australia to high 30s. So that's just increasing. So you can just see from a retirement, from a political point of view, just from a funding, people living longer, that we do need to do more work in this area.
Yeah, so one of the metrics that's reported in the intergenerational report is a dependency ratio. And it's not a perfect ratio by any means, because firstly, it assumes that there's no migration. And secondly, it assumes that everyone retires at 65. And there are plenty of cases where people retire later than that. So when they talk about the dependency ratio, it's really the number of people that are working versus the number of people who are sort of less than 15 and over 65. That's the dependency ratio.
Right.
And in 1981 to 1982, for every person aged over 65, there were 6.6 people of working age.
Okay,
so it's people aged between 15 and 65, basically. And then in 2019 to 2020, it's reduced to 4 people of working age. And then in 2060, it's projected to be 2.7.
Yeah.
So we see that there's the potential, but that's assuming that there's no migration. And it's also assuming that people will retire at 65. Look, and I know that there's a lot of stories about, people who are working beyond 65, but if you have a look at the majority of data in the ABS from the latest retirement and retirement intentions release, you'll see that a lot of people, the mean age of people, men retiring and women retiring, is not 67 or 65. It's not even 60. So we're assuming that people are going to continue to work for longer, but it's not necessarily playing out. That there is an increase. People are staying at work for longer, but the overall average age of retirement isn't increasing to what you might think it is. It's certainly not pension age.
Yeah, and those statistics are just amazing by 2060. And you can see where the government is, why superannuation guarantee and people self-funding their retirement is so important, and why I just see people I say to, I'm not interested in my super. I'll either never get it, or the government will change the rules and take it off me. They can't. They cannot afford to be paying the government social security pension forever, because there'll be too many people retired.
Yeah, and I guess also too that what comes into all of this is people being realistic about what lifestyles changes, less money will mean. So I think, one of the key things about retirement adjustment is whether or not people are happy to live a different lifestyle in retirement. It's a key consideration for when people are thinking about retirement and what that means for them. If they do have less money, how will it change their lifestyle? And are they happy with that? Because there's only really one way, two ways to do it. Either you've got and you maintain the income you had as an employee, or you learn to live with less, or you manage what you've got. So, there's only those scenarios playing out.
Exactly. And let's look at from about emotional or psychological point of view. Retirement is slowly getting a negative view in some ways, that it's retirement is people walking down the beach or playing endless games of golf. And a lot of people are now in the 40s, 50s, 60s saying, no, I want to be, I want the challenge. I want to go do another job, or I want to, it's nearly, it's people are sort of saying, well, I like financial freedom. I don't like the term retirement.
Yeah.
Because it has So what's
that's
your
right.
view?
Yeah, I've heard plenty of people saying, let's retire retirement, and they're coming up with different terms to refer to retirement. But in a sense, it's only the negative connotations that we self-impose on it, because for a lot of people, it's a time of, renewal. It's not an end to anything. It's a beginning of something else. And it's almost like a repivoting around what work means to people. And, it doesn't need to mean that you stop work. I mean, it can mean that you work in a different way. I like to think of retirement as just another career stage. You're a graduate in an organisation, you're an employee, you're a retiree. It's just a different career stage, and it doesn't need to exclude work. Some people will say that they work 15 hours a week and they call themselves a part-time employee. Other people work 15 hours a week and say they're semi-retired.
Yes.
And then there's another group of people who work 15 hours a week and say they're retired. So, I mean, it's really about the definition and how we feel about that term and how we use it on ourselves to self-define what retirement means. But it doesn't have to have negative connotations. It can be, I've seen many people really absolutely flourish in retirement. Not missing work, not missing the lack of flexibility, not missing getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning, not catching the train, working where they want to, doing what they want, spending more time on the things that they love and less time on the stuff in their job that they didn't really enjoy. So, I think that there's a lot of different ways that people sort of retire, but thinking about it as a career stage is a much more positive way to think about it, and a source of renewal.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I think it's coming back because people are looking at this. I want the financial freedom, but exactly the research you're doing in the 6 buckets. That's only one part of it. It's not, I've got enough money to retire, but then I just stop, my life ends. No, there's all these other areas, and, what will be your next big challenge. So where the research you're doing, is that mainly aimed at for, say, 10, 15 years prior retirement, so you can be fully prepared, so when that day happens, the whole next stage of your life is all set?
Oh, look, I don't know. I think people's timeframes vary, and I wouldn't like to say, you've got to, in the same way that people will say to me, how much money do I need to retire? And I say to them, I'm a psychologist, and if you're asking me how much money you need in retirement, you're definitely asking the wrong person. But I also think the question about when do you start planning is a very personal one as well, because it is connected to when you decide to leave. But I do think that there's big decisions that people make in their life around things like housing that will have long-term consequences that could probably be figured out earlier rather than later. So it's very dependent on when you think you're going to be exiting, but also where you're planning to live and who you're planning to spend time with, and who if you want to continue to work, is that going to require you to maybe keep a set of skills that you've got current, or to learn new skills or develop new networks? All of those things will take varying amount of times, but I don't think it hurts to start thinking about it in your 40s.
Right.
To think about what's next, in the same way that when you're a graduate, you don't walk into an organisation and you say, oh, this is it for me. Most graduates don't come into an organisation and go, well, I've made it, this is it. Most of them have got plans about what they're going to do next. I mean, it's the same sort of thing when you're 40. And even when you're retired, what do you want to do? What do you want to achieve in retirement? All of those things require, ongoing goal setting. And I'd encourage people to keep doing that.
And do you see people are going to, as you were saying before about your students, they'll be far more involved with this area or age sector or demographic, that people need to, there will be consultants or or coaches or something like that who will help people through this stage?
What I'd really like to see is better use and coordination of multidisciplinary disciplines. It's people like you and I talking together, Mark, for the benefit of helping a client. It's, having a multidisciplinary centre where you've got, in the same centre, you've got doctors, you've got psychologists, you've got financial advisors, you've got housing consultants. You've got a full range of different professionals who can provide advice on all of those different areas. And I don't think it's necessarily that we need one professional who can do all of it.
Yes.
But I think what we can do is be better coordinated, and I think we can create better synergies. That's what I'd really like to see happen.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I was even just having a conversation yesterday about someone saying, if I could change something for people in the 50s and 60s, it's actually especially for women who have either had their husband pass away or they're divorced, is that from the legal side as well, they do their job, but then the person is just left on their own. They've separated assets or they've received an inheritance. They should have someone, a multidisciplined, whether it's an advisor, accountant, and be able to advise them so that they're just not left on their own. And it's similar to what we're talking about now.
Yeah, it's those sort of synergies where you've got people referring on. And we sort of see this in a medical model, right? Like, the rehab model. When someone's in a car accident and they've had a major operation, the next step would be to put them into rehab. So, and, often there's additional services attached to the hospital that would help with exercises, or physiotherapists, or, people that would need to support that person to get back to be fully functioning. But we don't see that sort of synergies necessarily outside in financial services, and and psychologists might be with referrals to doctors, for example, and vice versa, where a doctor might refer someone onto a psychologist for treatment. But we don't see that sort of synergy happening in other professional services.
No.
And I'd like to see that happening more.
Yeah, so if you were given that magic wand and you were able, you had the ears of the government or Scott Morrison, who is that exactly? Is that, or is there anything else you would say? Yep, I would really like to get to see this for retirees or in this retirement area. I'd like changes.
Yeah, and I'd also like. So in addition to that, because you're asking me now, so I've got a long list. So I really like to see a virtual clinic set up with the work that I'm doing at the moment, where we're having a look at, doing the careers advice first. Then we're getting people to get some health advice, like health assessments, to really think about their health, and then talk to financial advisors. So those sorts of 3 steps as a starting point, like a virtual sort of clinic, building out to something much bigger that's more substantial, that includes medical, legal, housing, etc. So it's more holistic, like totally holistic. But the other thing I'd like within organisations, if anyone's listening from organisations, is I'd like them to think about reconceptualising retirement for their employees. So it is part of that career development. and calling out those people who've successfully transitioned and having a lot more options available for people other than just mentoring roles. Not everyone wants to be a mentor. So what other career paths can you provide for people, and what sort of flexibility are you offering? The other key thing is to create trust in the organisation between employees and their managers, because I hear a lot of people say to me, I'd like to go part-time, but I'm worried if I have that conversation with my manager, then they're going to hear, I want to be made redundant. So they never have the conversation. So I'd say trying to develop more trust in organisations is a key goal, and weaving retirement planning into career development conversations and making people feel that it's okay to explore without any expectations that there's going to be any immediate movement on that.
And I think the Americans do this much better than we do. Employee benefits and things like this, where I've always believed that for people who come into an organisation, there should be help for them from a financial point of view to get them, because if they're stressed out because they can't pay their mortgage payments or they've got a credit card, it's going to affect their work. So helping them with that sort of thing, but also helping them at the other end when they're trying to transition out, it's just going to make a happier and more productive employee. It just seems to make sense.
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of organisations will have employee assistance programs, and some of those employee assistance programs can include, access or referral to financial advice or financial assistance. But you're right. I mean, it's difficult for people to be able to figure out where to go to next sometimes, and having someone that can help navigate that space, especially during, trauma, if it's job loss or it's maybe a loss of a partner, having someone to help navigate people through those systems to figure out where to next is, I think, a really key requirement. And organisations could do that, I think. They probably see that they've got a responsibility, and they do it already now through the EAP programs. So that's partly, meeting that need. But I think it also starts with just getting people feeling comfortable about having those conversations in their organisations without any threat of redundancy.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. Let's just hope with the work you're doing, hopefully more employers and the government will listen. So actually that's probably is a good lead into, the research you're doing, which is what we started with. When is that expected, or if you can say, and what's the where do you think that's going to be used for?
Right. So right now the research, we've done a trial, and it appears to have been successful. So we're doing a major trial at the moment here. It's in March in the Eastern Seaboard. And as part of that, once we've finished evaluating it, and when we evaluate it, we look at a range of different things, like how much more confident are people, how much has it improved their financial self-efficacy, about making decisions about finances, what about their financial literacy. So we've got a range of different measures that we track, as well as if people felt they had a good time, which is always important as well. But we check out all of those different metrics to determine. We expect to have that major part of the data collection finished by May, and then we're hoping to have some reports out in around June.
Okay. And how does this? I just don't know. Do you talk to government? Do you talk to organisations? What do you actually, or what would you want this to be used? How's this research?
Yeah. So we distribute the findings widely. I mean, I've done several presentations. I'm even doing one next week here at Macquarie Uni for the community to talk about what we know so far. We also distribute it via Allianz Retire Plus, who's our research partner on the ARC linkage project that we have. They do a lot of publicity for us, and they push out the findings of the results and share them broadly with the community through, LinkedIn and other social media platforms, so that we can get the message out there. I've got an article today coming out in the Lighthouse, the Macquarie University magazine, about the research that we've done in preparation for the presentation next week. So we try to, and then we also present at conferences, sometimes academic conferences, but more importantly for me is that we get the message out there to the community. It's important that I share the results with my colleagues, of course, but they've got multiple, many of them will not necessarily be specialising in retirement planning or retirement adjustment. So for me, the biggest impact I can have is to get out into the community.
Yeah, and I just think the more people can be educated, knowledge is power is definitely true, that it's just going to help people. People just need, there's still so many people need to understand, retirement is a good thing, but you do need to be prepared.
Yeah, well, I think that also what we found is that when people continue to plan during retirement, when they've had to pivot to do something, like things have changed rapidly, they feel like they're already a bit more in control because they're sure of where everything's up to. So they're engaged with their finances, they're engaged with their health status, they're engaged with, the situation with their housing. So it's not so difficult to think about what's next.
Yeah. I've taken up a lot of your time. There's so many more questions I could ask you, but just appreciate your time. One of the things we always ask our guests is, the best piece of advice they've ever had. So may I ask you that question?
Sure. So in terms of the financial advice, when I was young, I was probably only about 7 or 8. I went to stay with my auntie Jean, who was a Scotswoman, and she spoke with a very broad Scots accent. So I often had trouble understanding what she was saying to me. But I had 1 and 2 cent pieces, and I don't remember how I came to be about them, but I was throwing them down the backyard, using them for entertainment, like throwing them into a tin, and the grass was long, so they were getting lost. And she came out and she was absolutely shocked. She said, "What are you doing, throwing this money down the backyard?" And I said, "Oh, it's only 1 or 2 cent pieces. I can't really buy very much with 1 or 2 cents." And she said, "But would you be doing it if you had 100 of them? And would you be doing it if you had 1,000 of them?" And suddenly at that very young age, I started thinking to myself, I think Auntie Jean's got a point. And I imagined, instead of a big trunk full of 1 and 2 cent pieces, and I can tell you from that day forward, I never threw them back down the yard again. And to this day, I still keep, a shrapnel tin of all the coins that I'm regularly, collecting and then taking back down to the bank. Even in this day and age, I still keep Auntie Jean's voice in the back of my head.
Yeah, now Auntie Jean sounds a very wise woman.
She was. She said a lot of other wise things, Mark, but I just couldn't understand them.
Yes, that Scottish accent sometimes. Joe, pleasure, and I would definitely like to get you back, because there's so many more things would like to talk to you about retirement, and we do need to just educate people on this subject.
Terrific. Well, thanks very much for having me, Mark. I hope it helps.
Thank you.
See ya.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to know more about Professor Joanne Earl and her research, visit researchers.mq.edu/en/persons/J-K-Earl. Also feel free to email me on admin@themoneysandwich.com or visit our website, themoneysandwich.com, if you have any questions or would like to learn more. Enjoyed this episode and want to hear more of A Bite from the Money Sandwich? Make sure you subscribe on your platform of choice so you can automatically receive each episode as soon as it's released. As with every podcast, this information is not advice, as not personalised to your own situation, and past performance is never guaranteed for the future. What we are trying to do here is to provide tips, coaching and education to help improve your money knowledge, which we believe can only be a good thing. See you next time when we take another bite from the Money Sandwich.